The climber brushed the snow off a small mound and froze. Beneath it lay the body of Beck Weathers. That day, a brutal storm had already claimed many lives, and Beck was supposed to be the next. The man wiped the ice from Beck's eyes and beard, trying to see his face. One look was enough to understand. He didn't have much time left. Meanwhile, far from Everest, Beck's wife Peach was waiting at home. She had grown exhausted from her husband's obsession with climbing and had already decided to leave him, but she wanted to tell him after he returned from the expedition he had dreamed about for years, the ascent of Mount Everest. Then the phone rang. Peach picked it up. A stranger's voice informed her that on May 11th, 1996, her husband, Beck Weathers, had died during the climb. But shortly after the team left Beck's frozen body behind in the death zone, something unbelievable happened. Beck suddenly opened his eyes. What happened next shocked not only the climbing community, but the entire world. This is the story of a man who was declared dead, yet survived Everest. What makes it even more astonishing is that Beck discovered climbing only at the age of 40, and very quickly it became an obsession. He had built a solid career as a pathologist in Dallas and had a large family, but despite all that, depression slowly consumed him. One day he came across the story of Richard Bass, the first man to summit the 7 summits, the highest peak on every continent: Kosciuszko, Punchak-Jaya, Vincent Massif, Elbrus, Kilimanjaro, Denali, Aconcagua, and the highest of them all, Everest. Bass was just a skier and a tennis player, not a professional climber. He had achieved what many thought impossible. And Beck, who wasn't an experienced mountaineer either, became convinced that he could do the same. He began traveling from one expedition to another, choosing harder and harder routes, rushing toward the goal of standing on all 7 summits. And according to him, this pursuit slowly pulled him out of his depression. But chasing this extreme passion, he drifted away from his family, especially Peach. She decided to divorce him, but since Beck was preparing for his most important expedition yet, she chose to wait until he returned. Before heading to Nepal, Beck made a decision he would later regret for the rest of his life. He underwent radial keratotomy to fix his nearsightedness, tiny cuts made directly on the cornea. The eye needs time to heal after the procedure, but Beck refused to postpone the climb of his dreams. And high on Everest, this choice would come back to haunt him. In May 1996, Beck joined a team of 8 ambitious climbers led by Mike Groom, with legendary guide Rob Hall at the helm, one of the most experienced Everest climbers in the world. Rob Hall had already climbed Everest 5 times. On May 9th, as the sun rose over the Himalayas, the team began their push toward the high camp on the South Col. They had 1 full day to get there, no more. The plan was strict: reach the camp, rest for 3-4 hours, and then begin the final summit push in the darkness of night, aiming to reach the top no later than 2 p.m. Climbers avoid the hardest sections after 2 p.m. because descending them in the dark can be fatal. Everything was going according to schedule. The team arrived at the high camp on time, joining 3 other groups already resting there. A dozen tents were scattered across the narrow, windswept ridge. Beck's group was the first to begin the summit climb, but halfway up, something was wrong. Beck suddenly became irritated, unfocused. The mountain ahead looked blurry, distorted. He didn't understand why until it hit him. At extreme altitude, a cornea that has undergone radial keratotomy can swell and crack. The eye loses its ability to focus. In other words, Beck was going blind. Doctors didn't know this back then. No one with that surgery had ever attempted Everest. And then things got even worse. Beck accidentally brushed his face with a glove covered in ice crystals. One sharp shard sliced straight into his already damaged right eye. His vision turned into a fog of shadows. By the time the team reached a narrow ledge known as the balcony, about 8,400 meters high, Rob Hall realized Beck could barely see. Hall ordered him to stop the climb and wait on the side of the trail while he led the rest of the group to the summit. Beck stayed behind, alone, half blind, sitting in the freezing wind. It felt like nothing could possibly be worse. Then the storm hit. By afternoon, 3 climbers descending from the summit found Beck still waiting. They urged him to come down with them, but he refused. Beck was terrified that if he moved and Rob returned to an empty spot, Hall would assume he'd fallen off the mountain and start searching for him, risking his own life. Beck believed Hall would return by 3 p.m., But then came 4 p.m. Then 5. Daylight faded. The temperature dropped sharply. The wind grew vicious. Snow began to fall. Beck still had bottled oxygen, so he didn't feel hypoxic, but the cold was crawling deep into his body. He began hallucinating. Strange figures appeared in the snow. His limbs grew numb. 10 hours had passed since he first stopped moving. Still, he waited for Rob Hall. Meanwhile, Hall successfully reached the summit with the others. But on the descent, one climber collapsed, unable to continue. Hall chose to stay with him until his condition improved. He told the rest of the team to keep going, and while Beck stood freezing in the storm, barely conscious, he kept glancing up the slope, waiting for the guide who was never coming back. It was only after 5 p.m. that Beck's group finally returned. They told him that Rob Hall, who was already 3 hours behind, was not with them. Realizing Beck couldn't stay there any longer, guide Mike Groom tied a short rope around him and began leading him down the mountain. But almost immediately the summit was swallowed by a violent storm. Those who were still high on Everest took the first hit. Rob Hall and the climber he stayed behind to help froze to death and never left the slopes of the mountain again. The blizzard spread downward, slamming into the descending teams. Visibility dropped to 0. The group had no choice but to keep moving, but Beck was barely conscious, and Yasuko, another climber, was in an equally desperate state. She looked like a walking corpse, and Beck didn't look much better. The rest of the team still had the strength to reach camp, but carrying 2 nearly immobile climbers through a storm was almost impossible. Many expeditions would have abandoned them, but this team refused. They chose to stay together, no matter what. One climber supported Yasuko, while Mike Groom half-dragged Beck by the rope. But just 400 meters from high camp, Everest struck again. An explosive gust of wind hit the group, and in the blinding snow they accidentally veered off course. They ended up only 8 meters from a sheer drop, a deadly 200-meter fall. They caught themselves just in time. In the chaos, nearly blind Beck lost a glove. For anyone else, that might have been an inconvenience. On Everest, it was a death sentence. Within minutes, he stopped feeling his hand. At first, Beck thought it was just numbness, but when he lifted it, he saw the skin had turned gray and lifeless. With horror, he screamed, "I understand now!" A powerful blast of wind knocked him off his feet and threw him into the snow. He drifted into darkness. At the edge of the cliff, Mike and the others realized their heroism was becoming dangerous. If they kept forcing themselves to help, the storm might kill the entire group. They made the hardest decision of the climb: leave Beck and Yasuko where they were, get to camp alive, and return with help. But when they reached camp, they found only one climber, Anatoly Bukrev. There was no one else, and the rescuers themselves were barely able to stand. So, Bukrev did the unthinkable. He went back alone into the blizzard. He eventually found Beck and Yasuko, but both were completely unresponsive, frozen to the ground. They couldn't walk, and carrying them alone was impossible. Bukrev had no choice but to return to camp. Beck was left behind again. The cold finally overwhelmed him, and he slipped into a deep hypothermic coma, a state where the body is so cold it can no longer function. Darkness consumed him. At dawn on May 11th, the storm finally weakened. Climber Stuart Hutchinson and 3 Sherpas set out to search for Beck and Yasuko. They found Yasuko's face covered by almost 8 centimeters of ice. She wasn't moving, but she was still breathing. Then they checked Beck. He looked dead. Almost dead. They believed there was nothing more they could do and began walking back to camp. Beck saw their blurry silhouettes fading into the white. He was abandoned again. But he didn't blame them. He understood the unwritten laws of the mountain. No one should die trying to save a dying man. His eyelids grew heavy. Meanwhile, far away, Peach sat paralyzed with a phone in her hand. She had just been told her husband was dead. Then Beck opened his eyes. At first he saw his home in Dallas, his yard, his family running toward him. But the image faded, and when he opened his eyes again, he saw snow. Real snow. After 15 hours in a hypothermic coma, Beck was hallucinating, but alive. His body had rewarmed just enough to bring him back. No one knows exactly how this was possible. Beck looked at the sky. The sun was beginning to set. He realized he had one chance, 1 hour, to reach high camp on his own. No one had ever survived 2 nights in the open on Everest. So he stood up. and the man everyone left for dead started walking. Beck realized he had only 1 hour to make it from the South Col to high camp on his own. No one had ever survived 2 nights exposed in the open on Everest without shelter. Driven by sheer will, he pushed forward, ignoring obstacles, ignoring pain. He hadn't eaten for 3 days, hadn't drunk water for 2. In his mind, he prayed for rescue. And somehow, Beck made it to camp. But salvation didn't come immediately. "Dead man walking," whispered the climbers as they spotted his figure approaching. They laid him down in a tent and left him alone once more. Despite many articles claiming he was abandoned only twice, a closer look at the story reveals he was left alone countless times. And this was no exception. There were reasons. Beck looked horrific. Though everyone marveled at his will to survive, it was clear he wouldn't make it to morning. Once again, he drifted into a dark sleep, the background filled with voices of climbers talking about the dead man in the tent. At dawn, the team packed up to continue. John Krakauer checked each tent to ensure no one was left behind. "Hello!" Beck shouted. John leaned into the tent where the supposed dead man should have been. His jaw dropped. He couldn't believe it. Beck was still alive. The news was relayed to base camp. Peach received another call. A mistake had been made. Her husband, Beck Weathers, was not dead. Yet. But she was warned not to cling to false hope. His condition remained critical. The end could still be tragic. Beck feared imagining what his family might be feeling. He realized the pain he had caused Peach by trading her for his extreme obsession. Meanwhile, a rescue operation began. An American Eurocopter nearby could have flown for him, but helicopters cannot reach beyond base camp, and Beck was at Camp 4. The thin, turbulent air of the storm made flight impossible even to the lower camps. Pilots had no choice but to abandon the attempt. Peach, having let go of her anger, became obsessed with saving him. She reached out to her network in North Dallas, trying to find anyone who could help extract Beck from Everest while he still breathed. That's how she connected with Lieutenant Colonel Madden Hatter Hethry, who agreed to attempt a rescue. Climbers carved an impossibly difficult path from Camp 4 down to Camp 1 to bring Beck within reach. Once at Camp Y, Madden Hatter flew him out in a battered B-2 Squirrel A-Star EQ helicopter, barely holding steady in the thin air. The pilot risked his own life to save Beck, one of the most dangerous helicopter rescues in mountaineering history. Beck Weathers survived the May 10, 1996, Everest disaster that claimed 8 lives. Most of my Everest stories ended there, either survival or death on the slopes. But Beck's story continued. He would fight for life even after returning home. Surgery awaited him. Blood circulation in his left hand was poor. In his right, it had stopped above the wrist. Reconstructive plastic surgeon Dr. G. Anigian worked to save any function in the left hand, despite frostbitten fingertips. The right hand, however, was lost. But the suffering didn't end there. A large piece of flesh above his right eyebrow fell into his hands. His big toe came off. His nose was frostbitten and had to be removed, but surgeons reconstructed it using forehead and neck skin and fragments of ear cartilage. Through it all, Beck worried most about Peach. Could she survive seeing him like this? He admitted his guilt and told her to let go, saying she didn't deserve to go through all of this with him. Her response was simple. "No, I'll give you 1 year." Beck walked away from climbing. He wrote memoirs about his experience, left for dead. His Everest ordeal was immortalized in films, and he became a motivational speaker, father, and husband. When asked if he would attempt Everest again, knowing the outcome, Beck said yes, and added that day on the mountain he had traded his hands for his family and his future, a deal worth making. How would you have acted in Beck's place? Or Peach's? Share your thoughts in the comments.